The cold winds of Winterfell howled through the stone walls, rattling against the wooden beams like whispers of the past. Jon Snow stood at the edge of the courtyard, gripping the hilt of his sword as he watched his half-brother's train. His breath formed mist in the freezing air, but his mind was far from the present. That morning he had received the news. His father, Lord Eddard Stark, had decided his future for him. He was to leave for the Wall. A bastard had no place in a noble house, and despite all of Lord Stark's kindness, the truth remained. Winterfell was never meant to be his home. The Night's Watch was an honourable duty, his father had said, a place where he would find purpose, brotherhood, a life beyond the shame of his birth. But was that truly his only path? Jon had spent the night lying awake, staring at the rafters of his chamber, questioning everything. He had always been obedient, always done what was expected of him, but this was different. This was permanent. If he rode to Castle Black, he would never have a wife, never have children, never return. He would die a man in black, forgotten by the world, buried in ice and snow. A bitter voice in his mind whispered, "What if you refuse?" And for the first time in his life, Jon Snow decided to defy his father. At the morning meal, the great hall was filled with the sounds of clinking goblets and hushed conversation. Robb sat at his father's right hand, speaking in low tones with Theon Greyjoy. Sansa and Arya sat beside their mother, who, unsurprisingly, ignored Jon's presence entirely. Bran and Rickon whispered to each other, their young minds blissfully unaware of the tensions that lay beneath the surface. Jon cleared his throat and spoke. "Father," he said, "I do not wish to join the Night's Watch." Silence fell like a blade slicing through the air. The hall, once filled with murmuring voices, went eerily quiet. Even the flames in the hearth seemed to crackle louder. Eddard Stark lifted his gaze from his plate, his expression unreadable. "Jon," he said, his voice calm but firm, "this is not a choice to be made lightly." "I know," Jon said, his fists clenched under the table. "But I belong here. I can fight. I can serve you." Robb looked at Jon in surprise. Catelyn's expression hardened, her lips pressing into a thin line. Theon smirked, amused by the drama unfolding before.
"Him? And what do you expect to be, Jon?" Lady Stark finally spoke, her voice laced with cold disapproval. "A Stark in name?"
"Will you sit at my husband's table and pretend to be one of his true-born sons?" Jon felt the sting of her words like a slap. He had never asked for that. He had never dared to dream that he would be treated as an equal. But was it so wrong to want to stay? To fight for Winterfell? Eddard took a slow breath, his jaw tightening. "This is not about name or title. This is about your future, Jon. The Watch will give you purpose." "I will find my purpose here," Jon said, meeting his father's eyes. "Please, let me stay." Eddard Stark was not a man who enjoyed conflict within his own home. He glanced at Catelyn, whose expression made it clear she wanted Jon gone. But he also looked at Robb, who seemed to silently wish for his brother to remain. Finally, he nodded. "Very well," he said, his voice heavy with unspoken words. "You may stay." Jon let out a slow breath of relief. He had won. But at what cost? John threw himself into training, determined to prove that he belonged. He fought beside Robb, sparring every morning with the young heir of Winterfell. He learned tactics from Sir Roderick Castle and studied warfare alongside the other young men
of the North. Yet no matter how skilled he became, no matter how many victories he claimed in practice bouts, he remained an outsider. Catelyn's cold stares never softened.
The whispers of servants never ceased. He had refused the watch, but he was still Snow, still the reminder of his father's past. Then King Robert Baratheon arrived in Winterfell, and everything changed. Jon watched as his father welcomed the king and his retinue. The Queen, Cersei Lannister, walked with regal arrogance, her golden-haired children trailing behind her. Prince Joffrey sneered at everything he saw, his lips curling in disgust at the North's simplicity. That night, Jon overheard a conversation that would alter the course of his life forever. In the corridors of Winterfell, late into the night, Jon wandered alone, unable to sleep. As he passed his father's chambers, he heard voices, hushed, urgent. He stopped, pressing himself against the cold stone wall. It concerns the past.
"And your bastard!" King Robert's voice rumbled through the heavy door. Jon felt his blood run cold. "I have kept my promise, Robert," Eddard replied, his voice weary. "I have protected him." "Aye," Robert sighed. "But for how long?"
The truth cannot stay buried forever. Jon's heart pounded in his chest. What truth? Before he could hear more, a hand clamped onto his shoulder. He spun around, coming face to face with Theon Greyjoy. "What are you doing, Snow?" Theon asked, raising an eyebrow. "Nothing," Jon muttered, shaking him off and slipping away into the night. But his mind was restless. His birth, his past, his father's secret. He had to know the truth, and he would not stop until he found it. Jon Snow had stayed in Winterfell. He had defied his fate, refusing the wall. But in doing so, he had set himself on a different path. A path filled with shadows, secrets, and dangers far greater than he had imagined. The White Walkers still stirred beyond the wall. War loomed on the horizon. And Jon Snow, the bastard who had chosen to remain, was about to learn that his true destiny was far greater than he had ever believed. Jon Snow could not sleep. The words of King Robert haunted him, circling in his mind like a wolf hunting prey. The truth cannot stay buried forever. What truth? He sat on his bed, staring at the dying embers in the hearth. His entire life he had accepted that he was a bastard, the shame of his father's past. He had never questioned it. But if there was more, if there was a secret his father had kept hidden, he needed to know. The thought consumed him. The next morning, he watched his father closely during breakfast, searching for any sign that something was amiss. Lord Stark was his usual self, stern, quiet, lost in thought. Jon clenched his jaw. If his father would not tell him the truth, he would find another way. He needed answers, and he knew exactly where to start. Maester Luwin was a kind man, always patient, always willing to teach. Jon had learned much from him over the years, about history, about the old gods and the new, about the great houses of Westeros. If anyone in Winterfell knew the secrets of his birth, it would be him. He found the Maester in his study, bent over a collection of old scrolls. The scent of parchment and candle wax filled the air. "Jon," Luwin greeted, looking up. "What brings you?"
"Here?" John hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward. I want to know about my mother.
Lewin's expression remained neutral, but John saw the way his hands stilled over the parchment. My mother? John repeated. My father never speaks of her. No one does, but I know there's more to the story. Lewin sighed. John, some questions have no easy answers. I'm not a child, John said firmly. Tell me. The Meister studied him for a long moment before shaking his head. Your father made me swear an oath never to speak of it. John's heart pounded. Then there is something to tell. Lewin's silence confirmed it. John clenched his fists. He had been lied to. He had spent his entire life believing he was nothing, just a mistake, a burden. But there was something more, something his father had hidden from him, and he would find out what it was. John knew he would get no more from Lewin. If he wanted answers, he would have to seek them elsewhere. But where? As he walked through the corridors of Winterfell, lost in thought, he nearly collided with Arya. "Watch where you're going, John," she huffed, brushing dust off her tunic. He smiled, despite himself. "You should watch where you're going. You move like a shadow." Arya grinned. "That's the point." John hesitated for only a moment before lowering his voice. "Arya, if you wanted to spy on someone in Winterfell, how would you do it?" Her eyes lit up. "Oh, that's easy. The hidden passageways." John blinked. "What hidden passageways?" Arya smirked. "You don't know? Winterfell has tunnels and secret doors all over. I use them all the time." John's heart raced. If there were hidden passageways, then there was a chance he could overhear the truth. "Arya," he said, gripping her shoulder, "show me." That night, with Arya leading the way, John crept through a narrow tunnel behind the walls of Winterfell. It smelled of damp stone and dust, but Arya moved through it like she had lived there all her life. "This way," she whispered. "Father's Solar is just ahead." John pressed his ear to the hidden door, heart hammering. Inside, his father was speaking in hushed tones with someone else. "Robert must never know," Lord Stark said. "If he does, John will die." John stiffened. His father's voice was tight with urgency. "But the boy will start asking questions," the other voice said. It was Maester Lewin. "He already has." "I will handle it," Lord Stark said. "He can never know the truth." John pulled away, his mind spinning. If Robert finds out, I will die? What did that mean? He turned to Arya. "We have to go." They slipped away into the shadows, but John's world had already changed. His father had been lying to him, and now he had no choice but to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Jon Snow's mind raced as he made his way back to his chambers. His father's words repeated in his head like a haunting melody. "If Robert finds out, Jon will die." Why? What secret could be so dangerous that even a king must never know? Sleep did not come that night. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts tangled in possibilities. He had always believed himself to be Eddard Stark's bastard, the result of some fleeting affair during Robert's rebellion. But if that were true, why would his father need to hide it? Why would revealing the truth put his life at risk? There was only one answer. I am not my father's son. The thought shook him to his core. If Lord Stark was not his true father, then who was? And more importantly, who was his mother? Jon knew he could not ask Ned Stark outright. His father had sworn to keep this secret buried, and if he confronted him now, he might lose whatever fragile trust remained between them. No, he needed more proof. And there was only one place where secrets of bloodlines and bastards could be found: the crypts of Winterfell. The torches flickered in the underground tunnels as Jon descended the steps to the crypts of Winterfell. The air was damp, filled with the scent of old stone and the lingering echoes of history. The statues of the past Starks loomed over him, their cold stone faces unreadable. Jon had walked these halls many times before, always drawn to the statue of his supposed grandfather, Rickard Stark, and his children, Brandon, Benjen, Lyanna. Lyanna. His father never spoke of her much, only that she had been beautiful and that she had died young. But as Jon stared at her statue now, something inside him stirred, a feeling he couldn't explain. A memory surfaced in his mind, fragments of a conversation he had once overheard between old Nan and Maester Luwin when he was a boy. She was wild, that one, old Nan had said, her voice low with old sorrow. A wolf in a cage built of love and war, Luwin had replied. But love is not always kind, a wolf in a cage. Jon swallowed hard. He had always assumed Lyanna had been taken by Rhaegar Targaryen against her will, that she had died screaming in childbirth. But if that were true, then why had his father hidden him? His heart pounded. Unless Lyanna had not been stolen, unless she had not been a prisoner, unless she had loved Rhaegar Targaryen. Jon felt the ground sway beneath him. His knees buckled, and he pressed a hand against the cold stone wall. If Lyanna Stark had been his mother, then Rhaegar Targaryen had been his father. He was not Eddard Stark's bastard. He was the last surviving heir to the Iron Throne. Jon staggered. Out of the crypts, his breath coming in short gasps, the world around him felt unreal, as if Winterfell had suddenly become unfamiliar, a place where shadows whispered secrets too terrible to bear. He could not ignore the truth. He was not Jon Snow. He was a Targaryen, and that meant Robert Baratheon. The king of Westeros would kill him if he ever found out. The realization sent ice through his veins. Robert had spent his reign hunting down every last Targaryen, ensuring that no dragon would ever rise again. If he knew Jon's true heritage, there would be no mercy. His father? No, not his father. Eddard Stark had kept him hidden for a reason. He had lied, suffered the whispers of dishonor, allowed the world to believe he had broken his vows, all to keep Jon safe. Jon clenched his fists. The weight of it all was suffocating. His entire life had been a lie, and now he had to decide what to do with the truth. Jon did not leave his chambers the next day. He sat by the window, watching the snow fall over Winterfell, trying to quiet the storm in his heart. He was no longer a nameless bastard, no longer the unwanted child of a northern lord. But he was not a Stark either. He was something else entirely. Knock at the door startled him from his thoughts. Robb Stark entered, concern etched into his face. "You missed training?" Robb said, sitting across from him. "Theon says you've been hiding like a ghost. What's wrong?" Jon looked at his brother, his cousin, he reminded himself now, and felt a sharp pang in his chest. How could he tell Robb the truth? How could he tell him that they were not truly brothers, that everything they had grown up believing was a
lie? He forced a smile. Just tired? Robb studied him for a moment before nodding. Father wants to speak with you after supper. John tensed. Did he say why? Robb shrugged.
No, but he's been quieter than usual. John exhaled slowly. His father, no, Lord Stark, knew something was wrong. He would have to be careful. That evening, John entered Lord Stark's solar. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the stone walls. His father stood by the window, gazing out into the night. "You've been restless," Lord Stark said without turning. John swallowed. "Yes, my lord." Ned Stark turned to face him. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something heavy, something broken. "You went to the crypts," he said quietly. John's throat tightened. He could deny it, but what was the point? His father, his uncle, already knew. "I did." A long silence stretched between them. Then finally, Ned Stark sighed. He suddenly looked tired, as if he had been carrying the weight of this moment for years. "There are things you were never meant to know," he said, "for your own safety." John's
hands clenched into fists. "So it's true," he whispered. "Lyanna was my mother." Ned closed his eyes for a moment, then nodded. John felt his breath hitch. "And my father?" Ned hesitated, then spoke the name John had dreaded and longed.
To hear, Rhaegar Targaryen. The words settled over John like snowfall, light and silent, yet burying everything beneath them. "I am not your son," John said. It was not a question. It was a statement, a truth he could not take back. Ned's face was lined with sorrow. "You are my son in every way that matters." John looked away. He could not bear to meet his eyes.
"What was my real name?" Ned hesitated. Then softly, he said, "Aegon." John flinched. The name felt foreign, wrong. He was Jon Snow. He was a Stark in everything but name. He was not a dragon. He did not want to be, but fate had decided.
Otherwise, John turned back to his father, his uncle. "What happens now?" Ned Stark exhaled slowly. "Nothing." John blinked. "You will stay Jon Snow," Ned said. "You will tell no one. You will live your life as you always have, because if Robert ever learns the truth, you will die." John stared at him, the weight of his newfound identity pressing down on him. He had spent his entire life longing for a name, for legitimacy, for belonging. And now that he had it, he had to bury it forever. A bastard still, a ghost of a name never spoken. John nodded. "I understand." But as he left the room, he knew one thing for certain. He would never be the same again. The days after Jon Snow learned the truth of his birth felt like living in a dream, one where everything was familiar but nothing felt real. He walked through the halls of Winterfell, trained with the men, spoke with his siblings, but deep inside he was not the same. He was no longer just Jon Snow, the bastard of Eddard Stark. He was Aegon Targaryen, the last surviving heir, to a dynasty that had ruled Westeros for centuries. A boy with dragon's blood in his veins, living in the home of wolves. But he could tell no one. The secret sat heavy in his chest, suffocating him. At night he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering what his life would have been if his mother had lived, if Rhaegar had won the war. Would he have been raised in the Red Keep? Would he have been a prince? Would he have sat on the Iron Throne one day? He would never know, because he was still just Jon Snow. And if the world ever found out otherwise, he would be dead before he could even dream of a crown. Jon had always felt like an outsider, but now it was unbearable. Every time he sat beside Robb, he wondered if his brother would still see him as family if he knew the truth. Every time Lady Catelyn gave him a cold look, he wanted to scream that he was not even Eddard Stark's blood, that he was not a mistake his father had made, but he said nothing. Robb noticed his quietness first. "You're different," he said one afternoon as they prepared for a hunting trip. "What's wrong?" Jon forced a small smile. "Nothing. Just thinking." "You always think too much." Robb clapped him on the back. "You're my brother, Jon. Whatever's in your head you can tell me." Jon felt his throat tighten. He wanted to tell him. He wanted to tell someone, but he couldn't, not even Robb. Instead, he laughed. "Just wondering if you'll ever beat me in a fight," Robb grinned. "We'll see about that." The conversation passed, but the feeling remained. The truth had placed an invisible wall between Jon and the world, and he was beginning to fear he would never feel truly close to anyone again. King Robert was still in Winterfell, his men drinking and celebrating, well past the point of decency. Jon avoided them as much as he could, but he could not avoid Robert himself. One evening, Jon entered the great hall late, hoping to grab some food and leave before anyone noticed him. But the moment he stepped inside, the king's booming voice
filled the air. "There he is," Robert bellowed, slamming his cup on the table. "Eddard's bastard!" Jon froze. The entire hall turned to look at him. "Come here, boy," Robert said, waving him forward. Jon hesitated, but obeyed. As he approached, he saw Lord Stark watching from the other side of the room, his face unreadable. Catelyn sat stiffly beside him, not looking in Jon's direction. Robert clapped Jon on the shoulder, nearly knocking the breath from his lungs. "You got the North in you, that's for sure. Big, strong, stubborn." He grinned. "I bet. You're a fighter." Jon nodded stiffly. "I do my best, Your Grace." Robert laughed. "Good lad. You remind me of your father when he was young. God's the trouble we used to get into." Jon forced a smile, but his mind was screaming. "You fool, I am not Ned Stark's son."
If Robert ever learned the truth, that warm grin would turn to cold steel. Lord Stark stood then. "Your Grace, Jon has training early in the morning. Perhaps—" "Yes, yes," Robert waved a hand. "Off with you, boy." Jon bowed and quickly left the hall, his hands trembling. He could not stay in that room for another second, not with Robert so close, not with death hanging over him like a shadow. That night, Jon made a decision. He could not stay in Winterfell forever, trapped by a truth that could never be spoken. He needed a purpose. For days he considered what to do. He could not ride south, not with King's Landing crawling with Lannisters. He could not declare his name, not while Robert Baratheon breathed. But there was one place where he might still make a difference. The Wall. For years he had dreaded the idea, but now it seemed like the only option. The Night's Watch was not just a prison. It was a place where a man could make his own name, where bloodlines did not matter. If he could not be a Stark and could never be a Targaryen, then perhaps he could be something else entirely. John took a deep breath. He would leave Winterfell, he would go to the wall, and he would never look back. Jon Snow had made up his mind. He could not stay in Winterfell, living a lie, trapped between two names that did not belong to him. If he remained, the secret of his birth would crush him. The wall was his only escape. He waited for the right moment. He knew if he told his father, no, not his father, he reminded himself, Lord Stark would try to stop him. So he said nothing. He packed a small bag, took his cloak, and made his way to the stables under the cover of darkness. Ghost followed, him padding silently through the snow. The direwolf's red eyes gleamed in the moonlight, watching as Jon saddled his horse. He was ready, but just as he was about to mount, a voice stopped him. "You're leaving." Jon turned sharply to see Robb standing there, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Jon's gut clenched. He had hoped to avoid this. "Yes," he admitted. Robb stepped closer. "Why?" Jon swallowed hard. He could not tell him the truth. "I don't belong here." Robb frowned. "Jon, you're my brother. Of course you belong." Jon let out a bitter laugh. "Am I? Or am I just your father's mistake?" Robb's jaw tightened. "That's not how I see you." Jon shook his head. "It doesn't matter. I need to go." Silence stretched between them. Finally, Robb sighed. "Then I won't stop you." Jon blinked. He had expected an argument, maybe even a fight, but Robb just looked at him with quiet understanding. "You'll always have a home here," Robb said. "No matter what." Jon nodded, his throat tight. "Thank you." Then, without another word, he mounted his horse and rode into the night. The road to Castle Black was long and cold. The north stretched out endlessly before him, vast and empty. Snow fell in thick sheets, covering the landscape in a blanket of white. Jon rode hard, stopping only when necessary. He knew the journey would be dangerous, wild animals, bandits, and worse. But he had Ghost with him, and that gave him some comfort. After 2 days of travel, he came across a small village. He stopped at an inn, hoping for a warm meal and a chance to rest. The common room was dimly lit, filled with the scent of ale and roasting meat. Jon found a corner table and sat down, pulling his cloak tighter around him. He kept his head down,
avoiding attention, but not everyone ignored him. "You look like a Stark," a gruff voice said. Jon glanced up to see a man staring at him from across the room.
He was broad-shouldered, with a thick beard and sharp eyes. Jon's grip tightened on his cup. "I'm no Stark," the man smirked. "Could have fooled me." Jon said nothing. He finished his meal quickly and left the inn, feeling uneasy. He had to keep moving. The sooner he reached the wall, the better. After nearly a week of travel, Jon finally saw it. The wall. It loomed in the distance, an immense structure of ice and stone, stretching high into the sky. A frozen barrier between the world of men and the unknown horrors beyond. Jon had seen it before, but never like this. Now it was not just a distant place he had been forced to consider. It was his future. He approached Castle Black, his heart pounding. The black-cloaked guards at the gate barely spared him a glance as they let him inside. The courtyard was filled with men, some training, some drinking, some simply staring at nothing. It was a grim place, filled with outcasts, criminals, and
lost souls. A man stepped forward, eyeing John with curiosity. He was older, with sharp features and an air of authority. "You must be the Stark bastard," he said. John straightened.
"My name is Jon Snow," the man chuckled. "Well, Snow, welcome to the Night's Watch. You'll find no lords here." John exhaled slowly. He had made it. This was his new life, and there was no turning back. Castle Black was not a place of glory. Jon Snow had known that before arriving, but reality was far harsher than he had imagined. The men of the Night's Watch were nothing like the honorable warriors he had pictured in his mind. They were thieves, murderers, rapists, and outcasts, men who had been given a choice between the wall and death. John had expected brothers. Instead, he found wolves among scavengers. Sir Alistair Thorne, the Master-at-Arms, wasted no time in making
his opinion of John clear. "You think you're better than the rest of them, don't you, Lord Snow?" he sneered during their first training session. John gritted his teeth. He had not called himself a lord. He had never once claimed to be better than anyone.
But he was stronger, faster, and better trained than most of the recruits, and that had already earned him resentment. During sparring, he made short work of his opponents, ragged criminals who had never held a proper sword. "You fight like
a bloody knight," said Gren, rubbing his sore ribs after John knocked him down. "I was trained by one," John replied. "Show off," Rast muttered. John narrowed his eyes. "You think I should fight worse just to spare your feelings?"
"You should learn to fit in," Samwell Tarly said softly. John turned to look at him, the fat, timid boy who had been beaten bloody by Thorne just the day before. Sam's eyes were filled with fear, but also understanding. John realized then that Sam knew what it felt like to be an outsider. For the first time since arriving, John found himself an ally. The nights were long at Castle Black. The wall loomed above them, a frozen behemoth that seemed to swallow the very sky. John lay awake, staring at the ceiling of his cold, narrow cell. The words still echoed in his mind. "You are Aegon Targaryen." Did it even matter any more? What good was a name when he had given up any claim to it? The world did not need another Targaryen. Robert Baratheon sat the Iron Throne. Ned Stark had protected him for a reason. If John were to reveal the truth, it would only bring bloodshed, and yet, sometimes when he closed his eyes, he saw a dragon in his dreams. Fire and shadow, wings stretching over the world, his mother's voice, barely a whisper. "Promise me, Ned." John clenched his fists. He had made his choice. He would serve the Night's Watch. He would leave his past behind. But fate did not let go so easily. A few weeks after John's arrival, a raven came to Castle Black. It bore dark news. John stood in the courtyard, listening as Lord Commander Mormont read the message aloud. "King Robert is dead." The words sent a chill down John's spine. The king was dead. The realm would descend into chaos, and somewhere in the halls of Winterfell, his father, his uncle, was now alone among enemies. John felt something deep in his chest, a tug he could
not ignore. Winter was coming, and with it, war. Jon Snow felt the cold more than ever that night. Not the biting chill of the wall, but something deeper, a cold that settled in his bones, one that no fire could warm. King Robert was dead. That
meant Ned Stark, the only father he had ever known, was alone in the viper's den of King's Landing, and Jon was trapped at the wall, bound by an oath to a cause that suddenly felt meaningless. His hand tightened into a fist. What had he done? News spread like wildfire through Castle Black. Jon watched as the other recruits carried on as if nothing had changed, because, for them, nothing had. But Jon was not one of them. He was a Stark. He was a Targaryen, and the man who had raised him was now in mortal danger. For the first time since arriving, Jon considered breaking his vows. Could flee south, ride for King's Landing, stand at Ned Stark's side. He had been raised to be a swordsman, a warrior. What was the point of all his training if he could not use it when it mattered most? He thought of Robb, Sansa, Arya, his family. What would they do if their father was taken from them? Jon clenched his jaw. He had to go, but escaping the wall would
not be easy. Jon had barely begun forming a plan when he was summoned to the Lord Commander's chambers. Jorah Mormont sat by the fire, his sharp gaze fixed on Jon the moment he entered. "You heard the news?" Mormont said. Jon nodded stiffly.
"Yes, my lord." Mormont studied him. "And now you're wondering if you should leave." Jon's breath caught in his throat. He opened his mouth to deny it, but the old man's stare bore into him. "I know you, Snow. I see it in your eyes. You're thinking of running." Jon said nothing. Mormont sighed, rubbing a hand over his beard. "You wouldn't be the first. Many men take their oaths lightly, but if you break them, you're no better than the criminals we take in." Stiffened. "I am not a criminal." "Then prove it." Jon clenched his fists. "My father." He stopped himself. "Lord Stark is in danger."
Mormont nodded. "Aye, the whole realm is in danger, but the Night's Watch does not serve kings or lords. We serve the realm itself." Jon felt anger bubble in his chest. "And what of my family? Am I supposed to just forget them?" "Yes." Mormont's
voice was firm. Cold, Jon stared at him, feeling as though the ground beneath him was crumbling. "You are a man of the Night's Watch now," Mormont continued. "Your family, your name, your past, they are gone. Your duty is here." Jon's
hands trembled. Could he really turn his back on Winterfell, on Ned Stark?
Jon spent that night walking along the wall, staring out at the endless expanse of snow and ice beyond. His heart told him to leave, to fight, to stand beside his family, but his honor told him to stay. Ghost padded beside him, silent as ever, his red eyes glowing in the moonlight. Jon looked down at the direwolf, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on him. "I don't know what to do," he murmured. Ghost said nothing. But then, far beyond the wall, a sound broke the silence, a howl. Not a direwolf, something else. Jon turned sharply, his hand instinctively going to his sword. The wind carried another sound now, faint, distant, but unmistakable. A scream. Jon's. Blood turned to ice. Something was out there, and suddenly his choice didn't matter, because the real war was coming. The scream echoed across the frozen wasteland beyond the wall. It was distant, but unmistakably human. Jon Snow's breath turned to mist in the frigid air as he peered into the darkness. He had heard tales of what lay beyond, the wildlings, the giants, the ancient terrors that lurked in the farthest reaches of the north, But this was different. This was something else. Ghost let out a low, warning growl. The direwolf's white fur bristled, his red eyes fixed on the vast expanse of snow and ice. John felt it too, a chill deeper than the cold, a weight pressing against his chest, whispering that something unnatural was approaching. He turned on his heel and ran. John burst into the Lord Commander's chambers, barely stopping to knock. Mormont looked up from his maps, frowning. "What?"
"Is it snow?" "There's something out there," John panted. "Beyond the wall, I heard screams." Mormont studied him for a long moment, then pushed himself to his feet. "Sound the alarm," he said. Within moments, Castle Black was alive.
With movement. The horns sounded, 1 blast for rangers returning, 2 for wildlings, 3 for... John swallowed hard. 3 meant White Walkers. The sound never came. Instead, a lone rider appeared at the gates, half frozen, his horse nearly collapsing beneath.
Him. The guards rushed forward, pulling the man from the saddle.
His face was pale as death, his eyes wild with terror. "They're coming," he gasped. "They're here." Then he slumped forward, dead. The body was taken inside, laid out on a table. The Lord Commander stood over it, his face grim. John watched.
His gut twisting. The man's skin was grey, his lips blue. Frost clung to his hair and lashes. "He's been dead for hours," Meister Aemon said quietly. John stiffened. Then how had he still been riding?
Ghost growled low in his throat. And then... The dead man's eyes snapped open. John stumbled back as the corpse lunged forward, lips peeling into a twisted snarl. The room erupted into chaos. The white clawed at the men around it, moving with unnatural speed. John barely had time to draw his sword before it turned on him. He slashed, but the steel barely slowed it down. The thing lunged, knocking him to the ground. John felt its icy fingers clawing at his throat, its breath like frozen death. Then, fire! Flames erupted across the corpse as Mormont hurled an oil lamp onto it. The white shrieked, its flesh blackening, its limbs convulsing.
Within moments, it was nothing more than ash. The room fell silent. Mormont turned to John, his face hard. "Now do you understand?" John swallowed. His heart still pounded in his chest. This was bigger than him. Bigger than...
His name, his blood, his past. The real war wasn't in the south. It wasn't the battle for thrones and crowns. It was here, beyond the wall. John met Mormont's eyes and nodded. "I understand." That night, John stood on the wall, looking out into the darkness. For weeks he had struggled with his place in the world. He had questioned his honor, his loyalty, his family. But none of it mattered now. The dead were rising. The long night was coming, and he was exactly where he was meant to be. Jon Snow, the bastard of Winterfell, the forgotten prince of a fallen house, had found his purpose at last. He turned his gaze north, gripping his sword. The fight was only beginning, and winter had truly come.